Greetings to my dear guests on this video. I wish you a pleasant viewing and look forward to your feedback in the comments. As soon as she finishes the code, we'll let her go quietly. She doesn't suspect a thing. Logan's friend will take over her job. She's just an old engineer stuck in the past. Helen Bristow froze in the hallway, hidden just out of sight by the frosted glass wall outside the small third-floor conference room. She had only come back for her cardigan. It was late, after 8 p.m., and the office was nearly dark. Most people had gone home, the lights dimmed to energy-saving mode, leaving quiet pools of fluorescent glow here and there. The voices drifted out clearly in the stillness. Logan Pierce, newly appointed office manager and son of the CEO's golfing buddy, was speaking. His tone was light, amused. "She's building the system we'll be using for years. Once it's done, we bring in Tyler. He already knows the basics." "HR won't push back?" asked the other voice, younger, nervous. "Won't she raise a fuss?" Logan gave a soft laugh. "She won't even know what hit her. She's not the fighting type." They were talking about her, Helen. She stayed there, motionless, heart thudding in her ears. When she finally backed away, cardigan forgotten, she didn't cry. She didn't even blink. She just walked out into the night air, her mind already working faster than it had in years. Helen had been with Braverton Technologies for 19 years. Through 3 management changes, 2 near bankruptcies, and more than a dozen reorgs. She was the architect of the code that still ran their core logistics platform, code no one else truly understood because no one else had ever bothered to learn it the way she had written it. Methodically, cleanly, with invisible safeguards built into every function. She had seen changes before, but none this blatant. Logan's arrival had disrupted everything. He was young, polished, always smiling, and always asking questions. At first, she'd assumed he was curious. Legacy systems didn't make much sense to people used to flashy new stacks. But his questions were oddly precise, targeted. Not about what the system did, about how modules connected, who had access, where backups were kept. And now she knew why. He was using her, letting her write the final structure, letting her do all the cleanup. Then, replace and erase. That night, Helen backed up everything. Every script, every subroutine, every note from the last 5 years. She encrypted the backups, hid them where only she would find them. She made notes, printed things out. She didn't know what she would do yet, but she would not go down quietly. If Logan thought she was slow or naive, he had made a fatal error. Because Helen was not just a programmer. She was a woman who had spent her entire life being underestimated. The next morning, Helen sat at her desk with a fresh notebook open beside her keyboard. A habit from years ago she hadn't needed lately, but one she revived now with purpose. On the first page, she wrote a date. No headings, no dramatic labels, just that. She would document everything. Not just for herself, but for the future she hadn't realized was in jeopardy until now. Looking back, she couldn't pretend she hadn't seen signs. Months earlier, perhaps even longer, there had been subtle shifts. Logan, freshly installed as office manager by the new CEO, had taken a keen and peculiar interest in the codebase Helen had maintained for over a decade. He started asking questions not out of curiosity, but for replication. At first, it seemed harmless. Management often showed surface-level interest in technical processes to impress investors. But Logan asked about her methods, not just results. He'd sit beside her longer than necessary. "So, what does this block do again? Can this be streamlined with machine learning? Is there any documentation on this section?" He had always phrased it politely, with that practiced smile he wore like an accessory. But Helen had begun storing her work differently, adding layers of obfuscation and custom encryption to her modules, not to hide them from the company, but to slow down prying eyes. Just in case. And now the case had arrived. What she'd overheard confirmed what her instincts had been whispering for months. They weren't planning to transition her into a consultant role or thank her for her years of service. They were going to discard her the moment her intellectual contribution was complete. The praise she had quietly worked for, the loyalty she had shown, it meant nothing to them. Helen didn't work on Aegis Core like most others did. Her work couldn't be easily copied or explained. Over the years, she'd created a system that was elegantly layered, self-correcting, and built to protect sensitive corporate processes. She'd started it years ago as a passion project and refined it in her spare time until it became the backbone of Braverton's financial backend. They had only recently realized how valuable it was. She knew now that Logan had taken her early design proposal, a quiet restructuring project that was supposed to optimize internal resource tracking, and spun it into his own grand initiative with a new name, a flashy timeline, and a pitch deck that he'd presented to the board like it was his creation. Logan's mistake wasn't that he tried to take credit. His mistake was assuming Helen didn't notice. Over the following weeks, Helen behaved as if nothing had changed. She attended meetings. She smiled when spoken to. She presented polished code updates and agreed to internal audits with grace. But behind the scenes, she worked differently, more carefully. Every major module she completed, she mirrored elsewhere, encrypted, archived, and anonymized in a personal cloud storage that no one could trace. She adjusted timestamps. She planted small triggers that wouldn't disrupt functionality, but would alert her if someone tried to recompile or move the code without her approval. And she began observing Logan, who he talked to, when he left his desk, what he printed. She noticed when he met with the new hire, Tyler, his supposed replacement for her. Tyler had a marketing background, not technical. His presence made no sense unless someone wanted a loyal placeholder rather than a capable engineer. Helen also started to talk, to the right people, not openly, casually. Lunch with Beth from compliance. A hallway chat with Alan in IT security. She asked leading questions. She didn't accuse. She just planted seeds. One morning, she intercepted a routine server request log and saw something unusual, an access query that looked too familiar. Someone had run one of her older test scripts on a company testing platform, but the user ID attached didn't belong to her. It belonged to Logan. Helen closed her laptop slowly and looked out the window at the courtyard below, the glass streaked with late winter rain. They weren't just planning to fire her. They were already trying to take what was hers. "I understand her system better than she does," Tyler said. The confidence in his voice made Helen's skin crawl. She wasn't meant to hear it, of course, but lately it seemed Logan and his friend Tyler had grown too comfortable in their deceit. They had their feet on the table in the break room at 7:10 a.m., sipping over-sweetened coffee and speaking as if no one older than 30 existed in the building. "She just makes it sound complicated," Tyler added with a shrug. "Legacy code isn't magic. I've seen her structure. It's redundant and bloated. I could streamline it in a week." Helen, unseen behind the half-open utility door, closed her eyes and took a slow breath. So that was their story. Not only would they fire her, she would be labeled incompetent on the way out. They'd pass her work off as outdated, inefficient, and make Tyler the savior. A textbook maneuver. She'd seen it happen to others. But this time, they chose the wrong person. That day, Helen stopped preserving what she had and started rebuilding. She didn't rage. She didn't storm into Logan's office. Instead, she rewrote everything. Not randomly, but deliberately. She replaced straightforward functions with elegantly disguised logic, nested conditionals, lookup routines that passed through subtle layers of redundancy, seamless to the system, but a maze to anyone unfamiliar with her design patterns. She rewired the skeleton of the entire platform, ensuring it would only function properly if you knew exactly how it had been structured. The interface looked the same. The output looked the same. But the foundation had changed completely. At night, she stayed late, claiming she was finalizing deployment. During those hours, she printed out logs, server records, email correspondence, access trails. She scanned old notebooks and collected her proposal drafts, timestamps intact. Every file she gathered told the same story. Helen Bristow had built the system. Alone. She made 3 physical copies and 6 digital ones. One went into a sealed envelope in a rented safety deposit box. 2 others, password protected, were sent to a close friend in her old department who now worked for a government agency. "Just in case," she wrote in the email, without further explanation. She didn't sleep well. The constant performance of pretending, smiling politely at Logan, giving weekly updates to Tyler, who sat beside her like a toddler pretending to read a map, was exhausting. But she endured it. Then, one Friday, it happened. Helen arrived at her desk to find a pale blue envelope sitting neatly in the center of her keyboard. Her name printed on the front. Inside was a one-paragraph notice from Human Resources. Effective immediately, your position has been made redundant due to departmental restructuring. Your departure will be handled in accordance with company policy. No signature, just a stamped name at the bottom. Claire Downey, Director of Personnel. Helen stared at it for a long time. She had no meeting that morning, no escort, just a quiet erasure. Around noon, Logan passed her desk. "Rough morning," he said with forced sympathy. "Let me know if you need help packing." She smiled at him, small, cold, controlled. "I already have everything I need." He didn't ask what she meant. Helen's desk was cleared by noon. No farewell, no speech. No one from HR escorted her out. She took her time, neatly folding a sweater, unplugging her charger, slipping a photo of her niece into her bag. Her computer was still on when she left. No one had asked for her password. No one thought they'd need it. By 1 p.m., Tyler was sitting at her desk. He wore a new navy blazer, a fresh haircut, and a grin too wide for someone who'd never contributed a line of production-ready code in his life. Within the hour, he sent a team-wide email. Excited to lead this next phase of Aegis Corps. Looking forward to refining Helen's foundational work and introducing new efficiencies. First presentation with external partners scheduled for next week. Let's build something bold. Helen read it from her personal inbox at home. She sipped her tea slowly and gave a small, soundless laugh. "Bold," she repeated aloud, then closed the message. She hadn't sabotaged anything. She wasn't that kind of person. The system worked. It passed all internal testing and had been quietly running on a shadow server for 2 weeks before she left. But it was dense. Oblique. It used self-referencing logic modules that rewrote their own execution patterns based on external triggers. Even someone skilled would need weeks to fully understand the structure. Tyler had no chance. By Tuesday, the first cracks appeared. At 8:14 a.m., Helen received a call from an unknown number. She didn't answer. At 8:31, an email came from Logan Pierce. Subject: Quick question. Hey Helen, hope you're well. Wondering if you might be able to clarify a couple of minor points about the data harmonization layer in the new build. Just a quick chat would really help the team. Let me know if you're available sometime today. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. Because by 10 o'clock, Braverton was hosting a virtual meeting with a major logistics partner, one that relied on their new platform to track freight consolidation across multiple vendors. It was supposed to be a breakthrough: unified architecture, real-time syncing, predictive analytics. All built on the engine Helen had finalized just days before. The call began smoothly. Tyler introduced himself with confidence. "We're excited to show you what we've developed in-house," he said, his tone pure TED Talk. "Our new system will allow you to reduce operational drag by at least 17%, based on our internal projections." He shared his screen, clicked into the interface, and then silence. The page flickered. The graphs were empty. The demo environment stalled on initialization. Tyler's cursor hovered, hesitated, then moved again, opening a diagnostics window he clearly didn't understand. "Are we still connected?" asked one of the external reps on the call. "Yes," Tyler said quickly. "Just a moment. Might be some local catching." Behind the scenes, the platform had failed to execute its pre-processing module. The harmonization layer hadn't loaded because it depended on a silent validation process that required an external key Helen had rotated and anonymized. It wasn't broken, but it was inaccessible, unless you knew how to unlock it. At 10:22, Helen's phone rang again. The same number. This time, she picked up and set the receiver on the table without saying anything. "I'm telling you, we need her help, just for an hour," Logan's voice hissed. "We can offer a consulting fee, whatever she wants. She doesn't even need to come in." A pause. A voice in the background, Tyler. "She made it do this. I know she did. This wasn't happening last week." Helen hung up. At 11:40, she received a text from an old colleague, Beth, from accounting. "Heard about the demo, train wreck. Tyler was white as a sheet, "Are you okay? Miss you around here." Helen didn't respond right away. She stepped out onto her balcony, wrapped her cardigan tight against the breeze, and looked down at the street. Braverton had made its move. Now it was her turn. The offer came from a firm called Nolan Gray Systems, a mid-sized consultancy known for rebuilding broken corporate IT infrastructures. Helen hadn't even applied. A former colleague, now a senior analyst there, had tipped them off after hearing about the debacle at Braverton. "Would you consider a conversation?" the email said. "No pressure, no politics, just coffee and curiosity." Helen didn't hesitate. She arrived at the meeting with a neutral blouse, a zippered leather folder, and the calm energy of someone who had already seen the worst and walked through it without flinching. They spoke for 2 hours. What began as a standard technical interview turned into something else entirely. When she pulled out a trimmed version of her Aegis Core documentation and described the system's silent recalibration cycles, the room changed. "You wrote this?" asked the lead architect, a gray-haired man named Brent who had spent 25 years in database engineering. "Every line," Helen said. "He studied the folder like a rare manuscript. I've only seen one other engineer design logic like this, and he's retired." At the end of the week, they gave her a quiet offer. Full autonomy on system design, no management duties unless she asked, and a salary higher than what she'd ever received at Braverton. She accepted it with the same steady tone she used when turning off the lights at night. At the same time, things were unraveling for Logan. On the day of his next investor prep call, Logan received an email from Internal Systems Compliance. One of the firm's mirrored environments had crashed due to missing dependencies. Tyler had attempted a full overwrite, an unauthorized one. At first, Logan didn't panic. He assumed it was a permissions hiccup. But then came the call from the infrastructure team. "Tyler deleted the test archive," the engineer said bluntly. "He thought he was clearing cache files and dumped the dependency chains. The restore point is corrupted. Everything connected to Helen's sandbox is gone." Logan's chest tightened. Define gone. The engineer hesitated. That archive was tied to the core deployment folder. The file signatures are unrecoverable. The scripts, the analytics engine, the transaction mirror, all gone. Logan turned ghostly pale. "Do we have backups?" There was silence on the line. "No," the engineer finally said. "That was the backup." The number came in later that afternoon. Estimated development cost of the deleted assets, including testing hours, proprietary logic, and lost deployment time, $13.2 million. Logan slammed the conference room door so hard the frame cracked. In desperation, he called Tyler into his office. "You told me you understood it." "I did," Tyler said, clearly rattled. "It's just... her version had all these hidden modules. I thought they were obsolete." "You deleted the core." "It was running on junk architecture." Logan paced, one hand in his hair. "My dad is expecting us to deliver a functional product this quarter. You've just wiped it." Tyler opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Across town, Helen sat in a quiet conference room with her new team, walking them through her design of a real-time analytics dashboard that auto-adjusted to bandwidth limitations. She passed around the printouts, each page stamped clearly with her name, the creation date, and her personal copyright. Brent smiled across the table. "I don't think Braverton knew what they had." Helen sipped her coffee, eyes calm. "They didn't," she said, "but they will." The first person to leave Braverton wasn't high profile. It was Megan from Infrastructure, a quiet woman who rarely spoke during meetings but had kept the entire network stable for 5 years. She resigned by email, gave no dramatic speech, and declined the farewell cake. She simply left. A week later, IT Security lost 2 of its senior engineers. Both cited directional misalignment in their exit interviews. In truth, they were tired of the chaos, of the incompetence, of watching good work rot under bad management. And then the whispers started. "Did you hear Helen's over at Nolan Gray now? She's already leading a new system design team. They're building around the architecture Braverton threw away." The rumors weren't rumors for long. In tech circles, word traveled fast. Everyone remembered the failed product demo. Everyone had seen Logan's forced smile in the follow-up video, trying to explain the temporary technical complications. It didn't take long for people to connect the dots. Helen was the architect, Tyler was the mistake, and Logan was the one who let it all happen. At Nolan Gray, Helen stayed quiet about Braverton. She refused to speak negatively about her past employer, no matter how many times reporters and recruiters prodded. But her silence only deepened the respect. Instead of talking, she showed. Her new system, a stripped-down, adaptive logistics platform, began to outperform projections by 20% in just the first phase of rollout. Internally, it was nicknamed Helen Line. The CEO joked that he wanted her name watermarked into the code. Back at Braverton, Logan sat through another exit interview, this time with Brandon from Product. He had been one of the last loyal voices in the room, often defending Logan's decisions. But no more. "This place is bleeding talent," Brandon said bluntly, "and you're still pretending Tyler can fix it." Logan rubbed his forehead. "We've made some missteps, I won't lie." "It's not missteps, it's ego," Brandon interrupted. "You fired the one person holding the system together, and now she's taking your best people." Logan snapped. "She's not taking anyone. They're just opportunists." "No," Brandon said calmly. "They're just not stupid." When he left, he walked out with a Nolan Gray Systems tote bag tucked under his arm. By month's end, 8 employees had resigned, 4 of them already hired by Nolan Gray. One of them even asked Helen directly during onboarding, "Did you plan all this?" Helen had smiled faintly. "No, but I'm not surprised." Logan, meanwhile, was unraveling. The executive board had begun asking tougher questions. Why was the firm hemorrhaging talent? Why had the Aegis Corps project been marked as inactive on their last quarterly report? Why was there no documentation to defend the firing of its lead developer? Logan tried to redirect blame. He pointed to team inefficiency, legacy resistance to change, and lack of cross-training. But none of it held. Not anymore. Worse still, whispers of potential legal action were beginning to circulate, not from Helen, but from a logistics client who claimed the failed deployment cost them significant revenue. Due diligence was the phrase being used in internal memos. Auditors had been quietly requested, and all the while, Helen kept working. At Nolan Gray, she reviewed code with interns, led architectural planning sessions, and kept building. Her systems were clean, her leadership measured, her past needed no defense. It was doing the work for her. CEO Russell Forrester was not a man who raised his voice often. He didn't have to. One raised eyebrow was enough to make entire rooms fall silent. But when he entered the Monday morning executive session, the tension was so thick you could have heard a paperclip hit the carpet. He dropped a folder onto the glass conference table with a flat thud. "Would someone like to explain?" he said slowly. "How we lost a $13 million code base and half the mid-tier engineering staff in under 2 fiscal quarters?" No one moved. Logan sat with his hands neatly folded, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He tried to speak, but his mouth was too dry. Russell didn't wait. "Let's walk through this, shall we?" He opened the folder. "The system we branded as Aegis Corps, the one pitched to partners, integrated into our roadmap, and featured in last quarter's earnings call, is now non-functional, correct?" A murmur of agreement. The lead engineer behind it was Helen Bristow, a veteran employee with an impeccable performance record, correct? Logan cleared his throat. "Yes, but—" Russell held up a hand. "She was terminated without formal review or departmental performance documentation. There was no complaint on file. No HR intervention. In fact," he said, flipping a page, "the only record associated with her departure is a vague note about team restructuring." Silence. Russell leaned forward. "So again, I ask, how does someone like her get replaced by someone like Tyler, who, according to this internal audit, deleted our only working environment by running a purge script on what he believed was junk code?" Someone coughed at the far end of the table. Logan's face reddened. "I made a judgment call," Logan said, trying to steady his voice. Helen was unwilling to collaborate, resistant to modernization. She wouldn't document her processes. We needed someone agile, adaptable. "Adaptable?" Russell repeated. Your choice of replacement destroyed years of development. And now, Nolan Gray Systems is winning contracts we were lined up for, using her code. She took the system with her. No, snapped Russell. She didn't. She wrote the system. And she documented it, under her name, which you failed to protect as company IP before firing her. Logan sat back, stunned. He had underestimated just how much Russell knew. Here's what I think, Russell continued, voice low. You underestimated her. You thought she was outdated, quiet, easy to replace. But she was the only thing keeping your department stable. He stood, buttoned his jacket. And you fired her to give your friend a job. The words hung like smoke in the air. Russell turned to the rest of the room. I want a full investigation into how this happened. Every approval, every meeting log, every security audit. I want to know who knew what and when. And I want options. Legal, operational, reputational. We will not let this tank the company. Logan slumped in his chair. For the first time since he orchestrated Helen's dismissal, he looked small. Meanwhile, at Nolan Gray, Helen was wrapping up a strategy meeting. Her team had just secured a new client. Ironically, one Braverton had lost after the Aegis Corps collapse. After the call, Brent approached her. Rumor is, he said casually, Braverton's CEO is digging through the ashes, looking for answers. Helen didn't flinch. He'll find them. Brent raised an eyebrow. You thinking of making this public? Helen shook her head. No need. You sure? Could be satisfying. She met his eyes, calm. I'm not interested in revenge. I'm interested in never being underestimated again. Brent nodded slowly. You've made your point. No headlines, no lawsuits, just a quiet reckoning. And the slow, inevitable collapse of the house that fired the woman holding up its walls. The first time Logan showed up at Nolan Gray's lobby, he wasn't even on the visitor list. The receptionist stared at him blankly. Do you have an appointment? Logan glanced down at his phone. His voice dropped. Can you just tell Helen Bristow that Logan Pierce is here, please? She tapped her keyboard. I'm sorry, but Miss Bristow is in a closed planning session this morning. It's urgent, he whispered. She'll want to hear this. But Helen didn't come down. She was in the second-floor conference room, seated at the head of a table of 6, discussing rollout schedules and error tolerance thresholds with her team. Someone mentioned that a man named Logan had appeared downstairs. Ignore it, she said calmly, without looking up from her tablet. He returned the next day. And the day after. By the 4th visit, security was instructed to notify upper management. Brent, the CTO, intercepted Logan personally. You're creating a disruption, he said, arms folded across his chest. I just need to speak with her. 5 minutes. Why? Brent asked flatly. Logan hesitated. Because I made a mistake. That afternoon, Helen received a formal request through her assistant. Logan Pierce had scheduled a meeting. She raised an eyebrow. Schedule it, she said, but only for 10 minutes, and only if it's on site. I want it visible. The meeting was set for Friday at 4 p.m. At 3:59, Logan entered the meeting room looking nothing like the smug young manager he once was. His blazer was wrinkled, his hair slightly disheveled. He looked more like a man coming from an emergency room than a boardroom. Helen was already seated, reviewing system audit results from a client integration. Logan closed the door behind him. Thank you for agreeing to see me, he said. She didn't look up. 10 minutes. He stood across from her, shifting his weight like a guilty schoolboy. We've lost 2 more clients. Tyler is out. Legal has launched a full inquiry and he faltered. I'm responsible for what happened. I should have seen your value. I didn't. And I've paid for that mistake every day since. Helen finally looked at him. He continued, his voice cracking. We need you back. You're the only person who can salvage what's left of the project. Please. I'm asking not as a manager, not as someone who wronged you, but as someone who truly regrets what I did. Come back. I'll support you in any way. You can name your role, your salary. I'll walk out if you want. I'll tell my father. Just help us. And then, to the silent astonishment of a passing staff member peeking through the glass, Logan dropped to his knees. I'm begging you. Helen let the moment stretch. Then she spoke. I wrote that system to support an entire company. You tried to hand it off to someone who didn't know the difference between a logic gate and a dead end. He nodded. You thought you were replacing a function, she continued. But I wasn't a function. I was the foundation. He looked down, ashamed. You didn't fire me, Helen said. You fired your company's future. She stood, gathering her notes into a folder. I have a team now. People who listen, who value knowledge. I've started something that's growing. Something Braverton doesn't deserve to be part of. Logan raised his eyes. Please, just think about it. I have, she said. She walked to the door and opened it. Your 10 minutes are up. The letter arrived by courier. Helen opened it slowly, eyes scanning the formal header. Forrester and Wexler, legal counsel on behalf of Braverton Technologies. Her lips pressed into a line. It didn't take long to read. The language was sharp, defensive, and familiar, alleging that Helen had retained and possibly distributed proprietary intellectual property following her termination, specifically referring to core components of the system she had developed, now functioning in prototype at Nolan Gray. They were accusing her of theft. She stared at the final paragraph. We formally request that you cease and desist all use of the architecture in question and provide full documentation regarding its development timeline. Failure to respond will result in legal proceedings. Helen folded the letter neatly and placed it beside her keyboard. Later that day, she called a quiet meeting with Brent and the company's in-house legal advisor. They're suing, she said plainly. Or planning to. Brent looked up from the document. You knew this might happen. I did, Helen nodded. That's why I documented everything. She opened a hard-shell briefcase she rarely brought into work, withdrew a thick folder, and laid it on the table. Inside was her defense. Timestamps of original drafts, metadata logs, version histories. Printed and digital copies of her source code stored on encrypted drives long before she left Braverton. Notes in her own handwriting, notebooks dated years back, all sealed in evidence-grade order. The legal advisor leafed through it, impressed. You were ready, he said. I had to be, she replied. I saw them coming long before they saw me leave. What Braverton hadn't realized was that Helen had submitted a formal intellectual property declaration a year prior, covering the adaptive logic model she had created during off-contract hours, a move they had ignored because, at the time, they didn't understand what it was worth. Now, with millions lost and their credibility collapsing, they wanted it back. The lawsuit was filed a week later. The tech world took notice. Articles appeared on industry blogs and in LinkedIn newsletters. Braverton files suit against former lead engineer over lost system. But it didn't generate the outrage Braverton hoped for. Instead, the comments turned against them. She built the system. They fired her and then begged her to come back. Now this? Corporate incompetence at its finest. Meanwhile, Helen's legal team countered with precision. Her documentation was airtight, her timeline unassailable. Her code structure had been revised significantly after her termination, and none of the changes had ever entered Braverton's servers. The heart of the defense lay in one phrase: independent authorship. A hearing was scheduled. The legal proceedings would take time, but privately, Braverton's new interim legal director had already warned the board. This is not going to go in our favor. Still, they pressed on. Not to win, but to scare her, to slow her, to salvage face. But Helen didn't flinch. At Nolan Gray, she continued leading her project. She issued no public statements. She granted no interviews. Her response was measured, deliberate, and powerful. Instead of press releases, she published a white paper on system elasticity in decentralized frameworks, based on the very code Braverton had tried to bury. It was cited in 3 academic journals and referenced by a Department of Energy project within 2 months. While Braverton burned resources in courtrooms, Helen built legacy. And by now, even the junior developers at Braverton, those who had once quietly dismissed her as old school, were reading her work, forwarding it to one another. Did you see what she wrote about multi-layer redundancy? Her name's all over the new architecture forums. Even from a distance, she was leading again. The ruling came on a cloudy Tuesday morning. Helen sat in the conference room, dressed simply in slate gray, sipping black tea as the firm's legal advisor read from the summary judgment. The judge had dismissed Braverton's case in full. There was no theft, no breach, no misconduct. In fact, the court acknowledged that Braverton had acted with negligence and unprofessional conduct in handling her termination, and worse, had attempted to suppress her authorship after the fact. Helen said nothing for several moments. Then, she gave a single nod. "Good," she said softly. By the following week, the story had spread across every major business and tech platform. Engineer vindicated in landmark case over intellectual property rights. How a quiet woman in her 50s brought down a corporate giant, with proof. The legacy of Helen Bristow, why competence still matters. Helen received offers from 2 universities asking if she would consider guest lecturing. She politely declined. For now, she wanted to keep building. Teaching could come later. At Nolan Gray, her team surprised her with a quiet celebration. Nothing dramatic, just a cake with her name on it, a small card signed by everyone, and a framed copy of her original architecture diagram, captioned beneath in gold. She didn't speak louder, she just built better. Brent raised a toast. To the one who proved that integrity beats noise. Helen smiled. Not because she needed their praise, but because it reminded her that there was still a place in the world for calm, quiet excellence. In the months that followed, Nolan Gray's new system, based on Helen's post-Braverton architecture, launched in 3 mid-sized logistics firms. Performance surpassed expectations. Investors took notice. Helen was offered a seat at the strategic leadership table. She accepted, not because of the title, but because it gave her a platform to make sure no one like her was ever underestimated again. And as for Braverton? The lawsuit's failure accelerated the company's downward spiral. Logan resigned quietly. The board ousted Russell Forrester as CEO 6 weeks later. Their stock took a dive. A large competitor absorbed them in a quiet acquisition nobody celebrated. One afternoon, months after everything had settled, Helen received a letter. Handwritten. No return address. She opened it slowly. Inside were just a few lines. "You were right. I was wrong. I ruined everything. I hope someday you can forgive me." Logan Helen folded it once and placed it in a drawer she rarely opened. She didn't need revenge. Or apologies. She had her future. And that was more than enough. The truth had stood on its own, not because it shouted, but because it never needed to.